Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Lovely to see you. Many of you I saw yesterday at our Siyum for our tractate Baba Batra. If you weren't there, by the way, it is posted on YouTube now. So I will share that link if you missed the Siyum, if it didn't work for your schedule and you would like to um, enjoy watching it. I will send a link in a few minutes once I've let everybody in. Which is about now. So I'm Rachel Scheinerman. This is my Jewish Learning Television, and we are continuing our journey through the Daf. Every week on Thursday, we review what happened in the last week with a different teacher. This week, since yesterday, literally, we turned the page on Bava Batra, we are actually going to be a little more forward-looking. We're going to go ahead and focus on Tractate Sanhedrin, which we began just this morning in the Daf Yomi cycle. We're joined by Rabbi Elliot Goldberg, who you also haven't seen in less than 24 hours. So go ahead and take it away, Rabbi Goldberg.
All right. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you, especially those who are at the CM. Well, especially everybody, but including those who are at the CM yesterday. Sometimes I feel like if I had been in charge of the Daf Yomi calendar, I would give us one day off after each Masachet just to rest and recover. I know there's something about the discipline about every day, but Shabbat's a value to take a rest. We don't get a Shabbat from Daf Yomi, but I feel like after the Siyum, you should get a day to celebrate. But either way, we're back to the grind. A new Masachet we're jumping in today. I want to talk a little bit about Masachet Sanhedrin, some things we're going to see. I'm going to mention some themes and some topics that are coming. So I guess there's a small spoiler alert with that. We're not going to dig into text from way off in the future, though. There's plenty to read, and you won't discover it all today. When we move from Baba Batra to Sanhedrin, in some ways, it's a continuation. We've been talking about civil. We've been talking about law. We are moving from civil law to criminal law, but there's some connection between what happened before and what's going to happen now. Meaning, the rabbis are going to discuss a whole set of laws and the punishment for breaking them and how that works out, how that plays out. And in some ways, it's similar to what we studied in the Babas, although we're moving past civil law, monetary law into whole different sets of kind of laws. We're going to deal with, because we deal with capital crimes, things for which the punishment is death. We're going to explore a whole different area of both biblical verses about those laws and a whole different area of rabbinic law about what those violations are and what they symbolize and what they mean and what punishment you get for them. So it's a turning of a page and a continuation, meaning it's on the theme of Nizikin, which is our Masachet as a whole. Looking ahead also, I just want to mention this now, and it because we're dealing with sort of consequences for action about things that are serious, towards the end of the Masachet, which is almost a half a year away, is what's called Perek Chelek, the chapter of Sanhedrin that starts Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelek Ba'olam Haba. Everyone, members of the Jewish people have a place in the world to come. That chapter has some divergence from the rest of the Masachet because it's a space where the rabbis talk about the ultimate reward for good behavior. What is this world to come? Where is this place that you go after if you've been a good person, and what does that look like? It starts to get some exploration, which we've peeked at here and there, like every topic, in the 5 years we've been with Daf Yomi. But it's one place where the rabbis explore some of their understanding of what's the reward for doing everything right. What are things that could lose you that reward, and a little bit about what the world to come is. And we get into some, I guess, speculation and theology about like what comes next. And I know in teaching rabbinics, people always, as a teacher of rabbinics, people are often curious, what what do the rabbis think about what's next? What's the world to come? What's the messianic era? There are a number of threads in Jewish tradition about the future and the future, capital F, when the world transforms to something different. And we see one vision of that in Sanhedrin that's coming later. A wonderful parak, and there's good stuff before then, but we should just know that's coming. So we're starting chapter 1 today. I want to note something about chapter 1 that's happens from time to time, but not often. And it'll lead to a suggestion I'm going to make about studying Talmud, although you might not want to take it for Daf Yomi, which I'll explain in a second. A unique piece of chapter 1 of Masechet Sanhedrin is that all of the Mishnah is up front, meaning in many chapters you have a little paragraph of Mishnah, you have a whole discussion of Gemara, you have another little paragraph of Mishnah, you have a whole discussion of Gemara, and it's broken up. So if you're reading Daf Yomi, you get exposed to the Mishnah, which is the organizing structure for the content of the Talmud, piecemeal, a little bit at a time, and you see what the Gemara says about it. What's different in this chapter is you read the whole chapter's worth of Mishnah first, and then you see all the Gemara that's on it. There's a way in which this Mishnah could be broken up into smaller pieces and spread out through the parak like it is in the chapter, like it is in other places. The editors chose not to do it this way here. But it leads me to think about the nature of the relationship between Mishnah and Gemara, and something that my Talmud teachers always taught me, which is it's a valuable exercise to read the whole chapter of Mishnah before you study the chapter of Gemara, or even to read the whole Masechet of Mishnah, the whole tractate of Mishnah, before you jump into the Gemara. And why is that? Right, the Mishnah defines the content that the Talmud's going to talk about, and as you know, there's not really a beginning and an end to the Talmud, meaning any page of Talmud could reference any other page of Talmud. Any chapter of Talmud could reference a topic from any other tractate. And in the place that you're in, the Gemara assumes the background of the place that you're not in when it quotes it. And sometimes you have to go look that up and see. And one way to help you, to orient you to the material, at least locally, not to the faraway places, is to really get a sense of what's the whole ballpark that we're in about the current topic, about the current tractate or the current chapter. So you have the opportunity in this chapter to feel what that's like. Meaning, you open up, you're going to open up page 2 and start reading. You'll see a whole really, really lengthy set of Mishnah, which we're not used to seeing. And what that gives you is the whole trajectory for the whole chapter. And then if in an earlier section of the Mishnah, the rabbis are quoting something from later, you've already seen it. And it gives you sort of a leg up on a reader that you don't have in other chapters when you haven't read the whole thing. So if you haven't noticed that already, if you haven't done your page 2 reading for today, note that when you read. I guess this is where I do want to make the suggestion, but I know it's sort of preposterous in the Daf Yomi setting with the pace of it. It's a nice thing to try to do for any chapter, right? If you start a new chapter of Gemara, if you started a new chapter of Gemara in a traditional, in a Gemara class, you might be asked to read the whole parak of Mishnah before you jump in and see what's there. I can't really ask you to do that with Daf Yomi because there's so much reading, and it's we're on. If you've been with us a while, you know what the pace is like. But there is something to it that at least I wanted to call out, and you can notice this chapter. All right, so that's one of the things I wanted to talk about today. The chapter that we're starting adds a second topic that we're going to look at in Sanhedrin besides the criminal laws that it discusses, because Sanhedrin is a place where the rabbis describe the rabbinic court system. So we don't only get laws and how an explanation of particular laws, what happens when they're brought to trial, what punishments are given for them. We actually get some insight into what the courts are and how they work. And we'll see in this opening Mishnah that we're going to see. Yes. Oh, sorry, Larry. I see your question. By chapter, I mean parak. Yes. I never know whether to use the Hebrew term, the Hebrew or Aramaic term, or the English term. Yes. By chapter, I mean parak.
We try and use English as much as possible to make this as accessible as possible. But
Yes.
if you
Chapters
use
are
both,
translated.
that's good too. So parak, chapter. Yep.
Yes. Tractate, Masechet. I've switched back and forth there. Those go together. Anyways, so what we learn in this opening long passage from the Mishnah today is the different sizes and shapes of the court, right? There are courts of 3, there are courts of 23, there's a court of 71. We'll see in the Gemara a lot the principle that is good jurisprudence that the rabbis knew. You don't want to have an even number of judges because there can be ties. And there was no vice president to vote for in a case of a tie like we have in the Senate. But they kept the courts at odd numbers so that we wouldn't have ties. But what comes to mind as I look at this first chapter is the question in the description of the judicial system that's here. I wonder, is this, can we take this as historically accurate? Is this the rabbis imagining how they would like it to be? What do we know actually about the court system that the rabbis had and put into place? And how are we meant to read the portions of Masechet Sanhedrin, of Tractate Sanhedrin, that tell us about the courts and how they worked? So a few thoughts about that to help us think this through. So first of all, outside of the Talmud, we don't have a lot of other historical evidence about the courts and what they look like. Meaning, this is our one source, and historians are always skeptical when there's only one source because there's no way to validate what we're reading here. But we also know the Talmud is a book that came together over centuries, right? And Jewish life in the land of Israel and then later in Babylonia developed over time. So it's highly unlikely that over the 6 or 7 centuries that are represented in this book that the courts were static in a way. We do know the Roman historian Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian Josephus, does mention that that the Romans helped set up courts in the 1st century BCE, and the word Sanhedrin comes from I can't remember if it's Latin or Greek, but comes from that world, and Josephus uses some of those terms to describe some of these courts. So we know that there's from Josephus that's the one outside source that mentions the fact that during the Roman period, where the Romans had control over the land of Israel and had some say in the governing structure, there were 5 courts set up in 5 different regions that started to exist and promote justice, and they were manned by locals. They weren't, judges weren't imported from Rome. There was a system set up, and people, of the different districts sat on those courts. And it makes sense that was in the rabbi's background and context, and they were thinking about it. And it also makes sense to me that the rabbis want us to think about that they were in charge of this as well. And we'll see when we get to chapter 2, where the rabbis talk about the high priest and the king and what jurisdiction the various courts that they've described in chapter 1 have over the high priest and the king. And that's sort of a classic chapter of Gemara, but it's a political conversation. I see Greek. Thanks, everybody, the linguist who looked it up for me. It's amazing the world we live in. I could be unsure and muse about it, and then we get an answer. There's a political question, right? Especially in the early rabbinic period, the period of the Mishnah, the temple still stood, right? The priesthood was a political source. the Sadducees, which represented like the aristocracy, was a political force, and a group, the Pharisees, which were proto-rabbis in some ways. That's a little oversimplification. Was an emerging political force, and there were different groups that had different vision for what life should look like in the land of Israel for Jews, what the rules should be, what religion should look like, and they had different visions of what it was about. With the destruction of the temple, the rabbis emerged as the primary force that carried the people forward. But it's interesting for me to think about as we look at Sanhedrin, what is the story that the rabbis are telling us that they want us to think about their role in keeping society in order, in being judges, in playing, in stepping into leadership roles. And I say that because I think it's an important frame for us to think about. The Talmud, yes, in some ways, well, it's a historical text, meaning it's an old text. It does give us glimpses of history, but it's not history in the sense that we think about what a history, a work of history is today. Meaning, right, they're not sourcing, they don't have references, they're not sourcing them, we're not looking at different opinions. So some of our read of the Talmud gives us a sense of the time, but it's also an exercise in historiography, which is about the telling of history, as opposed to history itself. So one of the things I want to encourage you to think about as you read Sanhedrin is what are the rabbis telling us, and what's their agenda in telling the tale of the court system in this way, and what might we learn about them, about the world that we're in, from trying to expose their bias as opposed to reading this as if it's a historical fact. Chances are, right, the work, so that's one slice. And I would say we have two windows where we look at this question. We see both the passages that are reporting. These are the courts, here's how they're structured, here's the procedure for interviewing witnesses. We could look at that and see, what roles do the rabbis put themselves in? What roles do they put other people in? How does that look like? What questions can we have? We also have a glimpse to the stories they tell about cases that come before them, right? Like we saw in the three Masechtot before, we'll see here too. There'll be stories about actual cases, about rabbis who sit in judgment, that give us a glimpse about how this theory that's described in these chapters go into get played out in real life. They're stories, of course, so they also have a bias to look at. And sometimes it's interesting to see, do the stories match the legal passages, and how are they different, and in what ways are the stories supporting what we see, and in what ways are those stories telling a different story about the courts and what they look like. I'm pausing to read one comment that just came across my screen. Oh, God. Oh, David says, can we study Talmud rather than get bits and pieces of history? Thank you for that, David. I actually, given that we're on the first page today, I unfortunately have an answer you might not be happy with. I have some of these framing thoughts from the Masechet more than text for us to look at today. Sorry that you were looking for something different today. Because as we're starting the new Masechet on page 2, I thought some of these framing comments might help us look forward. So Uriel asked a question that relates here to what time period is Pirkei Avot and its tractates about the Gadol judge. So we'll later we're in the Nezikin, the section, the Seder, the order of the Mishnah that deals with some of these civil laws. A Masechet Avot that comes later that doesn't have any Gemara about it, so it's not in Daf Yomi cycle, does talk about the passing on of the tradition from Moses through the times of the rabbis. That's another place where you could get a glimpse of how the rabbis tell the story of their own stepping into power and how they receive the tradition and where they get their authority from. It does talk about pairs of leaders who were leaders of the Sanhedrin, the Nasi and the Av Beit Din, right, the head of the court. And Nasi sometimes is translated as prince, but it's not prince. That's like part of a royal family. It's a political position. And those figures that are mentioned in Avot are potentially early leaders of the early Sanhedrin at the time that the Mishnah is reporting about. And Avot is a wide time frame because the people it mentions there starts a couple centuries before the Common Era and goes into the Common Era. But I like that someone called that out here because that's another section you can look at to see the rabbis reflect on where their authority comes from, how they use it, what they're empowered to do. And Avot, in some ways, tells a story that lines up with Sanhedrin, but it tells a story a little different from how Sanhedrin does. It's a worthwhile piece to put on your list, right? Because Avot just has Mishnah and no Gemara. It's not in the Daf Yomi cycle. I wish that it were. It's a nice thing to study, but you could put on your list for when we're done with Daf Yomi. There's some sections of the Mishnah we don't cover in Daf Yomi. It could be worth to go and look at that, especially in contrast with what we see here in Sanhedrin. So I want to pause here. I appreciate those in David's camp who would have liked to see some text today, and I know that's what we usually do today. And I also appreciate the comments from those who find this this background a little helpful as they move forward. I appreciate it's a little different presentation than what I usually do and what might happen in this space. And thanks for going along with it. We have a couple minutes before the end, and I would love to open it up to see if there are comments or questions you have about what I said or about Sanhedrin or about anything else that's relevant to our endeavor here. Anybody want to digitally raise their hand? And
so Bob is asking, has there often been a dichotomy between religious and civil Jewish courts?
Between religious and civil Jewish courts. So that's a great question. So let me start more modern, meaning we've already seen this in the Talmud, the principle Dina de Malchuta Dina, the law of the land is the law. There's a period of a time in Babylonia where the rabbis there determined that Jewish civil law didn't function while Jews lived in an empire that had its own civil system. Now that could have been a political decision that they couldn't have courts of their own, so they chose to say, well, while we're living in Babylonia, we're going to follow the rules of Babylonian Empire and not conduct our own civil courts, but we'll be in charge of our religious courts. So that's a place where there's separation, right? Life in North America, where I live, is like that too. Jews, by Jewish law, are required to follow civil law, and civil disputes are meant to be determined by the civil courts. And religious law is carried out in different places. It's a little fuzzier when you go back into the rabbinic period. The rabbis want, and this goes to, I guess, to look at what the rabbis want us to think in terms of reading the Talmud. The rabbis talk about, right, the rabbis certainly see themselves as authorities on religious life and on civil life. In some ways, they see that as one thing because all of it comes from the Torah, right? And if all our rules about how we build our society, both spiritually, religiously, right, economically, civilly, come from the Torah, in some ways it's all religious life, so there's no split at all. The rabbis of the Mishnah who lived under the Roman Empire had to deal with the fact that Rome passed laws and they had to deal with the consequences of not following them if they chose not to, or having their own courts if they chose not to. Right, there's some stories that we've seen in the Talmud about Jews who had civil matters before them but chose to take them to the Roman courts and not the Jewish courts, which by the narrators of those texts wasn't seen as a great thing to do, right? People who didn't find justice that they were looking for in the rabbinic court brought an internal matter to the external empire that made some trouble. The other ripple in here also is, and we'll see it some when we get to chapter 2, that talks about, how the high priest fit in. Right, we've read about the high priest before in terms of their role in certain rituals and holidays, but there's a question about, sometimes the rabbis sort of show that there are rabbis or elders who coach the high priest about what to do, as opposed to the high priest having priests train them what to do. So there's a question about, like, was the priestly class its own set of leadership separate from the rabbinic class, and were there different places there? And some might argue that, right, in certain centuries, religion happened in the temple, so religious leadership came from the priests in the temple, and the rabbis didn't assume that role until the temple went away. So that's a longer answer than I meant to give, and still yet an oversimplification, but I hope it touches on the question. Anybody else?
You got a couple more good ones here. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's fine. Thank you for reading the chat.
My scroll is imperfect here. Okay. Couple questions about whether the Sanhedrin predated the rabbis.
Oh, that gets into the cloudy part of the historical record. I mean, there is a mention in Josephus in the 1st century, which is the BCE, which is early. It depends when you date the start of the rabbis. As people are mentioning in the text now, there's a mention of the Sanhedrin in the New Testament as well. So that's the other external source that says that there was such a thing. It's totally feasible. I think it's to assume that, right, as Jews ruled themselves in the land of Israel, that there was a judicial system in place, and that there was some sort of court called, when the name Sanhedrin started to be used, right? It's the New Testament and the reference in Josephus are early ones, and then the Mishnah is next. There probably was one. Was it run by rabbis the way they describe here in its origins? I would say probably not. I think it's something that the rabbis saw, right? The rabbis started to read themselves. The rabbis might have assumed the structure of the court, and the rabbis might have adopted the name Sanhedrin for their largest authoritative gathering of 71 to make big decisions and ordain judges. I think there's a way in which there's an evolution between what was before and what the rabbis describe. And some of what that looks like is hard to know, because what's in the historical record is thin and veiled. But it's likely that there were structures in place, and the rabbi stepped into some of them as they became leaders or adopted some of those names. And it's a great case study for the political evolution over time. I wish I had. There's a couple. I'd have to go back to my bookshelf to look at. There's some wonderful writings that some academics have written about early rabbinic era and the political structure about Jews in the Roman Empire. That if you're interested in this, might be worth looking into. And I'm sorry I don't have some quick names to just spit out and put into the chat for you, but that's a great question.
Yeah. We have a comment that says, hey, what about Yitro, right? Parshat Yitro, we have the establishment of the Jewish court system from pretty much the Exodus from Egypt, when Moses' father-in-law sees that being the only judge for an entire people of 600,000 is a taxing job, and says, hey, you got to delegate here, dude. And that's an early text about a setup of a court system. In terms of like the 1st century before the destruction of the temple, I had a professor in grad school who referred to this as the period of sects and violence, because there were so many competing groups who competed for Jewish authority in this period. Notably Pharisees and Sadducees. We think of the rabbis as, to some degree, the intellectual and spiritual descendants of the Pharisees, but also others like the Essenes and so forth. And there was a lot of finger pointing about who was wielding authority and whether they were wielding it correctly. And some of that was in the court. So in regard to the Sanhedrin. So I believe it's been a long time since I studied the New Testament, and I don't like to speak authoritatively on non-Jewish traditions, but my memory of that is that the Sanhedrin is, from the New Testament's perspective, a corrupt Jewish leadership council. Yes? If someone knows better than me,
It's
please
not, I think it's
step
not.
in. Like a lot of what's going on in the Gospels is Jesus is very critical of Jewish leadership and corruption in there and a misalignment of values. So I don't know if that's helpful, but we had a Hanukkah question that I thought might be a good place for us to end today, since we are
Oh,
celebrating Hanukkah starting next week. So Robert Starr asks, the Maccabee story also shows splits in the Jewish community. Is the Talmud in defense of part of that story?
is the Talmud in, what was that last part?
In defense of part of that story.
Oh, um, well, it's true, right? The Maccabees, the time of the Maccabees was a splinter time for the Jews as well. In some ways, some of the Hanukkah story is really about a civil war, right? And the Maccabees taking over, in addition to being a liberating army. Um, the rabbis read the story of Hanukkah in part in shade colored by their experience of revolt against Rome, because the Maccabee story is one against revolt. So while sometimes in some Jewish eras the Maccabees are seen as heroes of standing up for Jewish strength, there are some stories in the Talmud that are cautious because the revolts that happened in the rabbinic era against Rome didn't go so well, and the rabbis are nervous about that. And the what's interesting, and we'll see some of this in Sanhedrin, is the descendants of the Maccabees. Right after Hanukkah, the Maccabees installed themselves as a ruling monarchy, and not all of the the rabbis don't look kindly upon a lot of the right the rulers in the Maccabean line, who install themselves over, and how that fits in. You know, there'll be stories about kings from the Maccabean line, and their interaction with the rabbis. We'll see as well. The rabbis there's a mixed reception to Hanukkah in the rabbinic era, although it's why what we talked about a long time in Masechet Shabbat. Right, most of the stories about Hanukkah appear in Masechet Shabbat, right, in the tractate about Shabbat, and the connection there, of course, is the candles. And there's a lot of material in the Talmud about how, where, when do you light the candles? What blessings do you say? And in fact, a late story about Hanukkah is the one about the miracle of the oil, but the rabbis were much more interested in talking about God's miracles than about armed revolt against an oppressive outsider. I see there's a whole bunch of nice other things that are connected that people have added in the chat that can be part of this answer as well. But it is time. Hanukkah is coming. It's still out there a little bit. You have a little time, but it's out there. Happy Hanukkah, everybody.
Yeah, I gave a class in the Hanukkah in the Talmud, sorry, I'm putting in the chat, a couple years ago. That's now on YouTube. If you're curious, I have some spicy opinions about this. My theory is that Hanukkah was this secular December solstice celebration that was wildly popular, that the Hasmoneans co-opted as propaganda for their victories, and that the rabbis actually were very ambivalent about Hanukkah, because the rabbis were very ambivalent about the Hasmoneans, because of course the Hasmoneans were very, very problematic rulers, politically, religiously, ethically, and so on and so forth. And I think there's some evidence that if the rabbis had had their way, they would have just gotten rid of Hanukkah, but people just love their oil and oil fried foods and candles in December. So they felt they had to keep it. That's my spicy take on Hanukkah. If you want to check out that class, there is a recording. So, okay. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Goldberg, for getting us kicked off into the next Sanhedrin. Into the next tractate. Thank you to all of you for showing up, especially again, if you just hung out with us yesterday. Always nice to spend time with you and learn with you. And we will be in your inbox tomorrow morning, and we will meet you over Zoom at this time in exactly a week. We'll see you then. Bye, everyone.
Take care, everybody.